And let's begin. We're going to talk about the elections held in Colombia this past Sunday, and what's the interpretation that the panelists have of it, and what they can tell us about the future of Colombia. We are proud of having the attendance of three persons that are quite informed, that have a lot of information and lots of interesting insights about the complexity of the politics of Colombia. Let's begin with Laura Ardila. Laura is a commentator, a columnist better, of El Espectador newspaper, and even more importantly, the author of a great book, and it's very important in Colombia, that was launched a couple of months ago, right? And it's entitled La Costa Nostra. It's a book about the politics in the Colombian coast. And those that are with us today, you know that the politics in the coast is complicated, it's interesting. And Laura dared, or I don't know how you say it in Spanish, but it's, yeah, better. It's, you got to have guts to write a book like that. So, Laura, thank you for joining us. We have Sergio Guzmán, who's the founder of Colombia Risk Analysis. I'd say that it's a think tank of Colombia that analyzes political risks. Thank you, Sergio, for being with us. And we have Santiago Londoño, who's in the council and the professor and a founder of the political science major of EAFIT University in Medellin. I would have said before, but Laura, you're in Barranquilla, right? Yes, I'm in Barranquilla. And Sergio, are you in Bogota? Yes, and Santiago is in Medellin. Thank you all for being with us. Okay, let's begin. Sergio, could you give us a brief summary of what happened on Sunday? Thank you. Well, Ken, to begin, I would like to shed light on the fact that 59% of Colombians voted on Sunday, and it's a figure quite similar to all of our latest or most recent elections. In the presidential elections, for instance, we had 50%, more than 50% of the people that voted. And then the last 4 years, 59%. So it's an election that had a lot of voters. It elevates a lot of feelings. There was big concern over the situation of the ceasefires that we had with the ELN, Clan de Gorfio, and the FARC and the Second Macatalia, because these illegal groups have been growing in the past 4 years. And we don't know if the ceasefire would stand these elections. There were disturbances in several populations like Gamarra, Cesar, where a person was burned alive at the registrar's office. In Nariño and in Putumayo also, there were disturbances and events. But we have to highlight that perhaps from a pessimistic viewpoint, we expected that the elections would be more violent than they were. We must highlight the work of the armies and the police of Colombia, and that the meetings held with these groups helped to decrease the violence of the elections. It doesn't mean that there were no pressures or that there was no aversion towards of candidates making their talks, but still, we can analyze this now. And I'd say that these elections became a bit more complex because these elections had 36 political parties. So to say who's a winner or a loser in terms of political parties or ideological branches doesn't say much, right? Some analysts say that Colombia went back to the right, but since the conservative party is part of the coalition of the government this first year, the victories of the conservative party not necessarily mean that the country is more right. And the biggest winners of these elections, you can't say that there's an ideal coalition. Laura will be talking about this surely ahead. Some say that the elections were good for the traditional parties, which in these elections always play it hard because in the elections of Congress and others, we have many seats, but in these elections, we had 132 candidates aspiring to 22,000 seats. So in these elections, we saw elections of money, where the parties played their political structure with regards to the next elections in 2026. And in these next 3 years of working. Now, what we saw and what we've analyzed is that those political parties which were perceived as being very close to the current government suffered and couldn't create big changes. Now, the government said, yeah, but we really won more than what we had 4 years ago. And they might be right, because 4 years ago, there was no pacto histórico. But for me, they minimized really the punch. The government, for instance, said after these elections that some years ago we had several mayors and councilmen. Now we have 10 governors, 32 deputies, and more than 700 councilmen. So the matter here is that Pacto Histórico was great, doing great with other parties. So they're saying that they're triumphant, but really the work was done by other parties. And that's being opportunistic. But you have to see that in cities like Cali, Lilian Francisca, which was the chair of the U party, had other seats for governors. So she's holding this and celebrating this like if she worked alone. The reality is that otherwise, and we'll see how complex it will be ahead. In the main cities of Colombia, for instance, in Barranquilla, surely Laura will be talking about this. It was nobody's surprise for nobody that Chad won in Atlántico. And this is something that for months everybody knew, and Laura will tell us why. In Medellin, the blow of the government was big. Why? Because Daniel Quintero, the current mayor, lost this with his candidate Upegui, and he's really lost everything. And the governor's office also was lost for the traditional party. And surely Sergio will talk, Santiago will talk about this. In Cali, there was an alliance made that was a surprise for many because nobody thought that Eder will be winning. The alliance of Diana and Eder really increased the dynamics in the political party and scenario. And surely Santiago can talk about this more. So we have to know in the political party, well, who we have to drive for. And in Bogota was clearly against Petro because he really emphasized that Gustavo Bolivar was the elected mayor for the Bogota Metro. Bogota was something core to the campaign, and Petro went to China to renegotiate the Petro, and he couldn't get it anything. And then he he tried to finance the making the underground metro, and still he really didn't get the votes he needed. So the message was clear against the president in Bogota, which a year ago got 2 million votes, and Bolivar only got 500,000. So it was hard for the government, any reaction of the government to minimize the loss, I believe, what is nonsense. And I think that now we'll see new dynamics between the central government and local governments, where we'll look at budgets, we'll see the conditioning of the financing, by the states. And this will create uncomfortable scenarios between the government and within the government. And with this, so we can discuss these results and see what other ideas we can have. Thank you, Sergio. Now we'll be revisiting everything that you discussed. Let's begin with one topic. Laura, in your opinion, are there national topics that really stood out in this election? Or is it more regional topics and local topics? Okay, good morning to everyone. What a pleasure to be with you. I believe that these elections, unlike those of the presidential elections, play with under different rules, especially because the topics are more regional. There's not a single topic really. I think that the metro in Bogota, because of it became something for all of the regions. It took over a lot of the news, and it really didn't interest. It only interested Bogota, but in the news and on the TV and the radio, you heard about the metro a lot. For instance, in Barranquilla, and surely we'll be looking at where there were no debates among the candidates. That's something interesting because of the political homogeneity we had in the city with the Char group, which won these elections. Other cities like Bucaramanga really focused on security. So I think that there was a topic that was seen throughout the country with different levels in the local debates and had to do with security. And it's a coincidence regarding the concern of the policy of security of the national government, for instance, ceasefires, the consequences it would have in the elections. So security was important. But beyond the topics per se, I would like to highlight something that wasn't seen in this topic. And I expected to have it because we talked about it a lot. It was core, and it's political practices, clientelism, and corruption. These were core topics in the campaigns of all the candidates in 2022. They were really important. I mean, to have a politician next to you or traditional politics next to you was not good for the candidates. And that was reflected on the results in a Congress in which more than half of the Congress people were renovated. And so we had to think about topics that made us think that everything has to do with the clientelism and the old way of doing politics would change the regional elections. To not go far away, in 2018, we had four elections in which traditional parties did not do well. Was when Vargas Lleras was the candidate that gathered all of these groups, and representatives of traditional politics had a terrible dive. Everybody thought he would do very well that year. Also, the anti corruption consultation in Colombia had more than 10 million votes spontaneously. So that happened in 2018 and 2019. In the local elections, the news, or better, one of the best of the biggest news was the winning of several candidates which people thought were like independents really, far away from the traditional politics, like in Cartagena, in Cucuta, or Buenaventura. And then we have 2022 when Petro wins in Congress. So we had backgrounds that made us think that although in these local elections, usually these groups win, which have had always regional power. This time we would have something different. But this wasn't a concern in these elections. And in my concept, excluding what happened in Bogota, the overall result that I see of what happened in the regional elections, Colombia, was the Colombia Nostra, meaning that system of mafias and clans to which the elite in Bogota delegated the power throughout Colombia and remained there with the regular use and buying votes. So these clans won in most of the cities and regions of Colombia. And with that, among other consequences, we see what's going to happen in 2026. It surely will see different relationships of people that are in Congress, and we'll see a different relation between Petro and the rest of the country. But I would say to open this discussion on the interpretation of the results of Sunday, that beyond the topics, I think that anti-corruption is something we didn't see in these results, and that we see a pendulum in which in Colombia, many hoped the end of clientelism and breaking away with the old ways of doing politics. But sadly, these elections of Sunday took us back to that. Thank you, Laura. Santiago, the floor is yours. Thank you for your patience. I mean, we're talking about national, and to a certain point, you know well, since you're in Medellin. In Medellin, the topic was more local. I mean, the failure of the current mayor, and also in Cali, the reaction was to the current mayor. So, how do you interpret the national and the local topics in these elections of Sunday? Thank you, Ken, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you, Laura and Sergio. I would go like to go back to what Laura said, but because what happened in Medellin, Antioquia, made us see the struggle against corruption was very important, particularly, and like to qualify this, because I wouldn't dare to say that the results of Medellin and Antioquia are an example that here we're fighting really against the old political culture and clientelism. But it is important to say, and now that Ken said it initially, that especially in Medellin, 73, almost 74% of the voters elected Fico, the former mayor. And these are not really votes for him and his new political party. We had 38 political parties. No, there is a strong vote here, very clear, against Daniel Quintero and his 4 years as a mayor of Medellin. And that vote, and I know it because I spoke with a lot of people, really focused this vote on the idea of being a punishment vote against the current government of energy. A lot of people, thousands voted because they understood that the only person that could do this, because the survey showed it, was Federico Gutierrez, and the useful vote was clear and strong. I mean, we're talking about more than 500,000 votes of difference between the former uh, Mayor Quintero and Fico. And the message here didn't have big differences of social stratums or if people were in the north or south. No. And I think that this is the first analysis we should make. Also, I'd like to talk about the Bogota media. During these 4 years in Medellin, we lived without the media of Bogota with regards to what happened in Medellin. Very few media really got to see what happened in Medellin. Clientelism, corruption that was taken by the mayor's office, EPM, and the many businesses that are part of EPM, which every year move more than billion pesos was cleared. And it was very difficult for the country to understand that Quintero, that arrived with the party called Independence to renew, that's focused on the youth, was just a political business guy. And he had links with all of the old parties and clans, but he gave a new face and everybody really believed him. So the results of Medellin is a direct blow. One, to the way he governed, to place the mayor's office, EPM, and the conglomerate to work for a political group to end a technocracy that was created in the city that was important, that had many years of knowledge and experience, and the axe fell hard on, and obviously the jewel of the crown, which is EPM, which is a company that's loved by the people of Antioquia. And it's hard to explain this to people from other regions where their utilities companies have disappeared or taken by political clans. But EPM, which is the second largest public business after Ecopetrol, has created spaces, the structures, of course, are not perfect, but this APM is loved, and this group focused on really attacking it. I wouldn't dare to say that the board was exclusively against the old political clans, but I would like to say it's against how Quintero tried to govern with certain limitations and reserves. It's really different to what we saw before. I wouldn't dare that we never had that before because we have had Luis Perez as a mayor, and we'll talk about him ahead. But I think that Medellin created a governance dynamics which the public and private sector, the academia and social sectors worked hand in hand and as a team to build public policies, develop territories, and not leave everything in all of the eggs in the same basket. In the governor's office, we also experienced a vote that was against and rejected, and also a fear against Luis Perez, which led the surveys. Luis Perez was a mayor of Medellin, also a governor of Antioquia in a previous period, and he had many chances of taking over. He arrived with Julian Bedoyo, the old political clans. And what happened is that Andrés Julian Rendon from Centro Democrático and other movements and political movements understood that people were tired of this, that the people wanted something different, and Rendon won and with 18 points of difference with Luis Perez. So Medellin and Antioquia moved to react to previous governments in Medellin and to possible governments in the case of Antioquia and against Luis Perez. There's also a message here for Petro and the national government. Initially, it was a very local, regional vote, yes. But also, since Daniel Quintero and Luis Perez have shown their connections with Petro and the national government, also several candidates said directly that they were against the national government. And here in Antioquia and Medellin, there is a big vote which is rejecting Petro, certain sectors of the left, and what's happened in this national government, which I don't think it was the principal vote, but you cannot ignore that the results of Medellin and Antioquia also lie with messages that go against the national government. So to end and to start talking about other things, I'd say that the big message of Medellin and Antioquia was strong. because it rejected political forms. It rejected political clans that have acted here before. And I think that now what we should ask ourselves, not only about Medellin, but also in Bogota, Cali, Barranquilla, Bucaramanga, is what will be the position of the local or regional leaders with regards to Petro? And what will Petro do with these governments? I think that this is important because the rest is past. Why people voted how they did is the past. Now we should focus on asking ourselves, how are the relations between these cities and departments where there are many citizens and votes that were very clear, with a government that needs to execute resources. Many times we forget that in the public, people, Petro will have a lot of money, and the big challenge is how that money will be executed in different regions and cities. And for that, in my experience in the public sector, necessarily we need ties to work, to have a lot of respect, and to have some trust with national sectors, department, and municipal sectors. Otherwise, it's quite difficult to execute resources. And let me end with this. I believe it's quite important also to see what will happen with the Colombian Congress, because now they are doing their campaigns for re-elections and they've understood the clear messages of the big capitals and departments from Sunday and their position and how they see the national government and how politics are done. And I don't think that they'll stay put. I think that in some months, I think that I understand now they will be discussing the health reform. I think that everybody will readjust in their political forces and groups in Congress with regards with the relation with Petro, capitals, and local governments. Thank you so much, Santiago. Other topics that we have to explore, of course. Let me go back to something that's it's quite theoretical, yes, but not that much. Let's see. Let's suppose that the clans, as you said, Laura and the others, never really disappeared. They wouldn't disappear in a couple of years or whatever. But they perhaps were waiting for an opportunity to show their force again. So my question for you is, do the progressives, for instance, meaning the like Quintero or Ospina and Cali, if they would have been successful in their work, what would have happened? Would they have won again? I understand, of course, it's impossible to predict, but I'm just doing this exercise. If part of of what happened to the clans really is a result of the bad work made by the independents. Do you have any thoughts about that? Okay, this is related to what Santiago said, and I want to add to what Santiago said on the bad work made by Quintero and the blow he got in the elections. Clearly, you have to wonder what happened. What happened? There's a rupture. Well, in Colombia, we don't have a structural uh, reform, and how we finance the campaigns, the clans will never end. But we were going in that path. There was a possible transition. I don't think I can answer to you with one thing, Ken, and it's the failure of those projects and the proposals made for changes. the failures of the progressives, or because really they were just disguised to have this, to carry on with the same practices of the traditional politics. It's not only Quintero, we have Caicedo and Magdalena, Jorge Iván Ospina, although really his work was what punished him. I think that the failure created citizens' despair. For instance, Cartagena, 4 years ago, it was the city in which, after years of being led by corrupt people and parapolitics, people were tired and voted for a gentleman that didn't even live in Colombia. He lived in the States. And his campaign was made by Instagram. But he proposed to change and to fight against corruption. People said, okay, we'll vote for him, leaping towards nowhere. And also, it was a failure. This person, which is William Dow, in his first year, didn't even start to execute the budget for many people in Colombia. In Cartagena, say that he's been one of the worst mayors. So Cartagena elected a mayor that has the whole political class again. So I think that one of the responses to understand what happened, I think it's key because it leads us to see what will happen ahead, is the failure of the alternative proposals. Also, we have Victor Vidal, who also went against the machinery but was criticized. I would say that this is not the only response and explanation, however. There's a lot of dependence in Colombia still on citizens and the clientels and the state that solves the politician. We see that a lot in local elections. In departments like Guajira and Sucre, the biggest employer is the state. So if you have a contract or a relative that works with the state, of course the vote goes to that person. So that's part of the answers of why the clans are still predominant in Colombia. I think that there's something else that's key with Petro and his relationship with the machineries. He arrived with something different in his proposals, but he's made alliances with machineries which have empowered them. For instance, in Cordoba, the elect government is Bechara, a traditional political guy that didn't vote for Petro, wasn't part of his campaign, but then he started to work with the U party and he became part of the coalition of Petro and received on the way bureaucracy. So the person that's currently leading Fido Previsora there is part or was proposed by Zuleta. So I also feel that this situation is not too clear with Petro. And because he says something, and in practice, he makes alliances, and he's been able to play. And I think it's more of a possibility. And I think that he works with clans, and he works. And everything what Pedro has done makes us understand what happened on Sunday. And when it comes to centralism, the coverage of Bogota, I think it also has an impact in Colombia. We we have been told everything for Bogota and for Bogota. And this is hard because that helps everything happen in other parts of the country. Everything that is told about what happens in the rest of Colombia arrives in the media late. We have electoral corruption. For instance, the clan Char, in which some journalists insisted in the Caribbean with the corruption with these machineries only reacted in the national media when there's a congresswoman captured. So we don't show these phenomena of corruption before the time they should be in the national media. Thank you so much, Laura.
Quería
Sergio,
mencionar dos cosas.
I wanted to
Tal
mention two
vez
things,
la primera
maybe
sobre
three.
William Dow, que,
First,
o sea,
with William
sí,
Dow.
entiendo el punto que hizo Laura, pero ha sido uno de los
Yes,
mejores
I
presidentes
understand
en
what
Colombia
Laura
que ha
said,
tenido
but
nuestro
he's
país.
been
Yo
one
creo que
of
eso
the
es de resaltar.
first
Yo creo que eso es de
mayors
resaltar.
in Cartagena
Sí,
that went
y
through the
González
4 years. That's
Entonces,
not, and
por un
that's
lado,
big.
por otro lado,
So on the one
yo,
hand,
yo siento
I'd
que
like to
también
say that.
la
Secondly,
pandemia
I feel that we're not
afectó
talking
realmente
yet about
a
the
los
pandemic
alcaldes de hacer
that
sus planes,
truly affected
porque muchos
these
de estos
mayors
alcaldes, no,
to
pues
go through
muchos
their
de ellos
plans because many of these
empezaron el
mayors, or all
primero
of
de
them,
enero del 2020
began
y el 6 de marzo del
January 1st,
2020, es decir, 2 meses
2020,
y 6 días después,
and in
tuvimos el primer
March,
caso de COVID-19 en Colombia.
we had the
Todos
first
sus
case
planes
of
fueron truncados
COVID-19 in
y,
Colombia.
y
So
entonces,
all of their
digamos, fueron,
plans
digamos,
were
lanzados
hit,
a un
of
escenario para el
course,
que
and
nadie estaba
launched, and
preparado.
they were launched
Me
to a
recuerdo que el
setting
ministro de
in which
Salud de
nobody was
Colombia en ese
prepared.
momento sí había
Thank
estudiado
God the Minister of Health
epidemiología
of
y
Colombia
el presidente Iván
studied
Duque contrató muchos de estos
epidemiology,
presidentes sí
and
creían lo que
President
decía la ciencia
Ivan
y no
Duque
como
did
algunos otros
believe
presidentes decían que esto era
in
una
what
mentira.
science
Pero
said,
yo sí creo que
and
el COVID
unlike what
dañó
others said that it
las
was a lie.
mayorías
But
y
I think
tuvo,
that
o sea, ese
COVID
efecto de los líderes
did
locales
hurt
que solo empezamos
the
a ver
mayors
como
and the
su verdadera
governors
gestión en
back then,
los
and we
los
started to
últimos
see their true
año y
plans
medio, que
in their
todo fue
last
truncado por
2 years or
una
year and a
elección
half.
presidencial
And that was
y
hit,
por
of
supuesto
course, with the
después
presidential
el COVID vino
elections, and of
casi
course,
sin piedad.
social
Entonces, digamos,
manifestations
yo
that
creo
we
que
saw that
esa
were so
parte no
strong
la
back
deja
then. So
incumbente
that I
a
think that
nivel
this is part
latinoamericano,
of a
específicamente
wave that we
en
saw
Portugal, en
specifically in
donde
Latin
ellos,
America
digamos,
and
tuvieron un
globally,
electorado decepcionado
in which
y sería
they
equivocado pensar que
face an
el
election.
electorado
And
está
I
decepcionado con
think
los incentivos o con la izquierda,
that the
sino el
voters
electorado está decepcionado
are disappointed with the
con lo que
left.
ya había.
I think that the
Simplemente querían
voters
algo muy
are
distinto.
just
Entonces, en este
disappointed
sentido, yo
with
siento
what
que los
there
alternativos o la
is.
izquierda
So I
toman
think
sus
that the
resultados
alternatives
porque
or the left
también hay demasiada
are
insatisfacción
ending their days.
con
No,
las maquinarias
there's a lot of
políticas y
insatisfaction
tradicionales que
with the
funcionan acá.
political
Y,
traditional
y
parties that
para
Laura
hablar un poco
mentioned.
sobre lo que viene,
And to talk
no puede
about
negarse
what's coming,
que una semana antes de las elecciones el presidente
of
Petro
course,
empezó
a
a
week
ofrecer
before
ya 10
the
millones de
elections, Petro
recompensa para la
started
gente
to
que vota.
offer
Yo
10
creo que
million
esa es la próxima
to
flecha
the pesos
que
to
va a dar el
those that buy
presidente de
votes.
frente. Yo creo
That's something
la
that we
nueva
should
fiscal
highlight.
ya
I think
confirma
that the
el
new
fiscal,
fiscal,
por eso afirmo que será una nueva fiscal. La nueva fiscal va a estar encargada precisamente
the new
de dar
fiscal
seguimiento
will
a la
be
compra
in
de votos.
charge
Y yo creo que
of
esa es una de las
following
cosas
up
que
the
la primera
purchases of
preocupación va a ser el
votes.
presidente Petro de
And
ahora en
the
adelante
big
es
fight that we'll
contra la
see
política
with
tradicional,
Petro
contra las
is
maquinarias electorales.
against the traditional
Es
politics
cierto
and the
que
electoral
depende de Petro para
machineries.
pasar su agenda
And
legislativa
it depends,
sobre
he
qué tan
depends on
importante va a
that
ser esa
for his
agenda. Yo,
legislation.
digamos, para mí, entre líneas
So
leyendo
for me,
lo de las
just reading
manzanas
this
y
between
lo de la
lines
compra de votos,
with the
Petro y Alejandro
apples
Char
and
me
buying
parecen
votes, Petro
sus
has
principales
Alejandro Char
opositores
as
y
one of
que
his
allí va a
main
estar dirigiendo una gran parte
in
de
the
su campaña.
opposition. And I think
Obviamente, pues
that most of his
él tiene
capital,
mucho más
political
peso
part,
político.
capital will be
Gracias,
invested
Sergio.
on
Sergio,
attacking Char in the
gracias por la
next
palabra,
3 years.
quiero añadir otra cosa.
Santiago, let
Hace
me add another
5
question before
años
you say something.
hablamos
2 years
del
ago,
Centro
only we
Progresista en
talked
Colombia.
about the Progressive
Fue un
Center of
electorado en el cual
Colombia in reaching an
posible
agreement
postulación de algún candidato
on
para ganar
the
las
possibility of having a
elecciones. Todos
candidate
sabemos
to
qué pasó
win the
en ese
presidential
proceso.
elections, and we know what happened in this
Sabemos el
process,
fracaso de ese esfuerzo.
and we could say the failure
Entonces, mi
of that.
pregunta ahora es,
So my
después de
question
todo
now
y lo que
is,
sucedió con
after all that
supuestos
and what happened with
progresistas
the
como Quintero, si podemos
quote unquote
llamarlo
progressives like
así,
Quintero and Ospina,
¿dónde está el centro progresista en Colombia?
where is the center, the progressive center of Colombia today
Las
and
próximas elecciones
perhaps
presidenciales?
for the next presidential
Bien,
elections?
con respecto a la pregunta anterior sobre
Okay,
qué
with
pasó
regards
y
to the
los que
previous
desaparecieron o no
question, what happened
clanes
and if
políticos nunca
the
hubiesen
old clans disappeared? They'll never disappear, and they have a reptilian power of hiding. They have resiliency, and their speech changes like nothing. Let me give you a specific example. The liberal groups, which were with Daniel Quintero and with Petro, made their transition without any problem whatsoever to move to Rendon from Centro Democrático and to say that they were against Petro and Quintero without any problem. They lived with them the 4 years, they had contracts, appointments, and they became from the opposition because those votes are useful. And that's the complexity here. I mean, the serious question, this has to do with your second question, Kenneth. How can we win elections in Colombia? And if we can do it clearly without resorting to these old political clans, to their practices and their power to mobilize. I think that that's the big question here about the possible transformation of the country and politics. And Laura said, the current system doesn't let us do it. How we finance the campaigns also. Let me add this. If we continue with the system elected using the current system, we're condemned because the control organisms are elected by the clans to hide themselves, protect themselves, and to also attack the political enemies, because that's how the controllerships, the Procuraduría, work, municipal, district, and so here we have a huge problem as well. The system won't change while those that control it are the hands of the old political parties. And it's the way that they can remain, hide, and attack their enemies. And I think that's also a reflection that's core. So they have a great power to hide, they're resilient, they can stand alternative governments for 4 years, they prepare for that. Because as Sergio said, if it's not the national government, they're local governments. So I have a president and I'm invoicing nationally, but if not, I can win the mayor's office, the councilman, and I'm invoicing there. So it's quite complicated to have that game. And I don't see a true way under this constitution and with political system to end those plans or practices. I don't see it. But obviously, there are moments, sparks, and times when there's some hope. The problem with the center is that it hasn't been able to turn those moments, those sparks, into a project that's sustainable in time. I think that there's a problem because if we look at what Fajardo made or what's happened in certain moments in Bogota, and I think with Carlos Fernando and Juan Daniel also. Look at that second vote of Oviedo. That's a big, big message because if we're talking about with a center without structure, machinery, and no history, Oviedo got the second number of votes in Bogota and he'll be in the council. So I think that it's a big message also. And finally, I believe that the big challenge of the center is to be able to turn those sparks of triumphs, of good things in projects that are sustainable in time. And with my own experience, I'd like to say that when you move in the system, you realize the huge threats that there are, for instance, to turn a political movement or a big push from the citizens that turns into votes into a party that has to follow current rules, has to seek financing, and that its members and candidates and followers can have some type of future in that political structure. And there, of course, the clans win because young people want to get into politics. They say, what's in it for him, for me? And the clans say, no, here, take your money. You can be a candidate. So it's a huge competition that's quite unequal. And let me end by saying this. I think that with the current system, it's quite difficult to have a center that's truly autonomous and that will win elections sustainably.
regresar a ti en un
Laura,
momento, pero
let
nada
me
más
get back to you in a
tomando
minute.
los puntos
Taking
de Santiago y sobre todo
what Santiago just said,
un contraargumento no puede ser el
uh,
éxito
can't you
que
say
ellos
that the
pues
success,
no fue éxito según
or maybe
piensan ustedes?
maybe I'm wrong here,
Tú estás en Bogotá, pero
whatever,
el éxito
Sergio, since you're in Bogota,
de Claudia
the
López en Bogotá
relative success of Claudia Lopez
los
in
verdes
Bogota.
tenía una
She
administración
won with the
fuerte,
Green, with the Verde Party,
se acercó
and her
más al
administration has
centro,
been
siempre tenía
was
machismo,
more towards the center,
ganó,
and her
salió con una
profile was
aprobación
more center left.
relativamente
She
grande.
won. She got an approval relatively
No,
good.
es
Or am
cierto,
I wrong here?
y Claudia
No, it's
López
true, Ken.
logró elegir
Claudia
a 8
Lopez
concejales del
elected
Partido Verde, 8 de Colombia y
councilman of
5
the
baja
Verde
del
Party.
12 que había ahora
8
con
of
el liberalismo
45,
que tiene
she dropped
otros
from the
8
12, and
territoriales
neoliberalism
y
has
eso le va
8
a dar
others
gobernabilidad
of
a
45,
los
so that will
territoriales.
give
Y el
governance
tono no fue
to
confrontacional de
Galan.
Claudia con Galán,
And
sino
the
decirle que Galán
non-confrontational
fue
tone of
privilegiado
Claudia
por
Lopez
ser
and Galan was
precandidato
good.
en las elecciones de hace 4
Galan
años, entonces
was the
reclamó su
main
curul
candidate
constitucional desde
against
donde la
Claudia
afiliación al gobierno de
Lopez
Claudia
4
López,
years
entonces
ago.
tampoco es tan claro el
And
triunfo de
so
Galán.
it's not really
Hay unos
clear the
que
triumph of Galan.
que adhirió o le dio continuidad a Claudia
What
López. Yo creo
really
que
did it give continuity
el
to Claudia
voto en
Lopez?
Bogotá también fue muy
I think that the vote in Bogota
radicado
was
en la calidad
also
o en la mala
very,
calidad de
very
Gustavo
much
Bolívar como
based
candidato.
on the poor
Hace 4
quality
años el candidato
of
elegido
Gustavo
era
Bolívar
Holman
as a
Morris y
candidate.
este año el candidato
Holman
era
Morris
Gustavo
was the
Bolívar,
candidate of the
un hombre
left
llamado
4 years
Uribe,
ago, and now Gustavo Bolívar,
narconovelas, pero una
uh,
persona que también era el
he
principal alfil
he
del
was a
presidente
writer
Petro
of narco
en las
novels,
elecciones y
but
no
he was too
respondía
close
ni
to
un
Petro
ápice
in the
en
elections,
primer
and he
lugar.
ever
Él
hid
fue la cabeza de
his
lista
ties
del
with Petro.
partido,
Firstly, he
renunció
was the
a ese
head of
puesto
the list of
porque
Pacto Histórico.
aparentemente no era
He
suficientemente
resigned from the
grande como
Senate
senador por el tiempo que tenía en
because
el
he
presidente,
didn't
24
earn
años
enough in
libre
the
en
Senate.
Colombia es una fortuna, sin duda.
And in it's a fortune what he won, but he thought it was short for him. And he started to make a campaign after he resigned. And his main flag was not only education in English for young people, but also the underground metro. So I believe that most of the people in Bogota don't want an underground or a high rise metro. They just want a metro. And Bolivar wanted a metro with more uncertainty that was quite distant, and the vote was in favor of anybody that was not Bolivar. So Galan, if Oviedo would have shown more feasibility in the surveys to win over Bolivar, I think that almost everybody would have voted for Oviedo, but Galan, from the very beginning, showed a chance. And Bogota being the only city where there would be a runoff, many citizens voted for Galan to avoid that scenario because Petro was saying for weeks or months pushing for the campaign of Bolivar. So it not necessarily reflects a favoritism or continuity of the mayors of Claudia Lopez, but not to have Bolivar as their mayor. Thank you, Sergio, Laura. Thank you for your patience. There are many topics on the table that you can choose on. You can choose one or all. You're right. But I'd like to say that you live in the city with the strongest clan or most dominant in Colombia. So what's your viewpoint with Barranquilla? On the center, I'd like to say, I feel that one of the main challenges or the debt that the center has had, which is not really defined as such, is the political work made in the regions of Colombia. We go back to centralism. I think that a big triumph has been in the big cities, and that is not only because of the political parties, but because there has been no effort to really make a political work and to have great leaderships beyond the elections, because they start to move in the periphery of Colombia only for when elections start. And it's of course very difficult to work in the big cities. I've seen this, I've witnessed how this happened. And the center doesn't exist in the periphery, and that's convenient for the traditional political parties. So I think we should have a self-criticism of the center leaders. I'd like to also add to what Sergio said on what he thinks will be a new struggle of Petro for the buyers of votes. I disagree with what he said and there, because Petro has done absolutely no effort as a candidate or as a president of Colombia to finish with the electoral mafia. No effort whatsoever. That announcement really should be interpreted, and you can tell me, with really as a campaign to try to push whoever was the opposition or the competition of Pacto Histórico. And that's how I saw it, really. There's no effort really made by him. The political reform, the change of the system, the call is made by this Congress. And this is a Congress in which was renewed almost 50%. Those that have to make changes in Colombia are those that benefit with the current electoral corruption. The representatives of these machineries are in Congress, and they're not going to shoot themselves trying to change how to finance campaigns, right? But really, here, the Congress was renovated, and we have seen no leadership from this government that has the majority in Congress to make big changes. And that leads me to the to having the char group. It's a clan that will continue. I'm quite impressed with what happened in these elections, because on Sunday, almost for the first time, we changed the status of this plan. I think everybody knows the story here. It increased the exposure of the clan. I thought it was news here. Remember, one of the main players of the clan is Arturo Char. He's a Senate and he's in jail for corruption. And there's an international media that's talking about matters. I talk about this in my book, how in Barranquilla there are conditions to have some asset laundering, so money laundering. But what really impresses me, it changes the image and exposure for the clan in these elections. But what really hit me from Sunday was the omission in the public opinion throughout the country about this. We have seen no media in the country that has started to look at the investigation. What you saw in the coverage in Barranquilla were laughters. People say, oh, in Barranquilla, it's okay. Where everybody knows who will win. I mean, what do you mean by nothing can be done? Things must be done. Because really, for the first time, I saw an exposure of this group. And the national media and the authorities should begin to look at what happens in Barranquilla with this political group and clan seriously. International media are starting to talk about the structures of drug trafficking there. So Barranquilla in the next 4 years will have 2 decades with the CHAR group, not only controlling the mayor's office, but also the governor's office of Atlántico through a precarious democracy in Colombia. I think for good or bad, in the rest of the regions, there are pushes among powers, questions, yes, but that's a democracy. But in Barranquilla, it's the other way around. There's an absolute control of everything that happens, of the public debates, of the council, which again is in the hands of this political group. And it's a precarious democracy that we see here. And it's really worrisome to see that this model has is something that other leaders in the country want to imitate. And it helps us understand how they stay in the power. For instance, we see cases like the elect mayor in Cartagena, who in the campaign said he wanted to use the CHAR model in Cartagena. And so we have to keep an eye on what he meant with that. So I'm worried that we not only have a, a country that wants to take a good look with a magnifying glass of what's happening in Barranquilla, but we also see other leaders that want to imitate what happens in Barranquilla. Thank you, Laura. Let's give it 10 more minutes more before we end. And thank you for the panelists for staying with me. Last question. I have many questions, and thank you for sending us all of your questions. But my last question is, what does all this mean for the next 3 years in Colombia? What options do Petro have to carry out his proposals that he's tried to promote? What's your outlook, Sergio? Look, I still think that Petro has an enormous power of coercion in the regions. Many of them receive 70% of their budget through Bogota, and others 30%. So the government has a lot of power. Otherwise, on the other hand, the traditional political parties can push the president in his pension, labor, and health reform, and with his sons who's being investigated. So, as you can say, there's a Mexican standoff between the president and the political parties. And I feel that the political parties want to hit not too hard, but this president doesn't want to hit lightly because his attitude has been quite different in this past year and a half that he's been in term. So many say that there will be a change of cabinet, yes, but only not having Quintero and Caicedo is not good enough to have this conciliation. And we also have to keep in mind something, and it's the Twitter or X of Petro, in which he mixes things constantly. So it's not a sale. I think he will be confrontational and it will be life or death.
presidente introduce
I
una
mean, the
solución
president
absolutista
introduces
en
options
el discurso,
that are
en donde
absolute in
ahora
his
somos corruptos
speeches,
o
and
no
now
corruptos
we are
o
corrupt or
paramilitares
not
o
corrupt
paramilitares, mejor dicho,
or
el presidente va a
paramilitary or
continuar
not.
esa brecha
I mean, the
tan grande
president
para
will
el país.
continue opening that damaging
Gracias, Sergio.
gap
Sí,
for the
Santiago.
country.
Vamos
Thank
a
you,
ver
Sergio.
más
Santiago,
expresión del diálogo,
will we
lo que
see
lo que está diciendo Sergio,
that
más o menos.
that
Sí,
the
es así.
dialogue will be
Yo
harsher?
entiendo es que
And if
vamos a ver
so,
3 años de
what I understand is that we'll
estancamiento.
see 3 more years of
Caretaker government por
stagnation.
3 años. ¿Es así o hay
Caretaker government for
posibilidades
3 years.
de
Is
avanzar en
that
los
so,
temas
or are
para
there
el bien de
chances
todos?
to advance in topics for the good of all? I would expect so, but I don't have big hopes. Unfortunately, the president is quite previsible, predictable. I mean, look, his popularity has been dropping and his government has been punished in surveys strongly and consistently. So this is another blow against him. And the problem with Petro is that he doesn't react to the blows, taking a step back, but instead he gets into the fight stronger. And that's part of his history and his life. He is confrontational. He does not trust sectors, traditional sectors, business people or academia that are not with them. So I fear because it's not only an opportunity that's lost. I think that there are deep damages that can come with the relationships in this country. Having a president like Petro, I think that he should understand the message because he needs the regions and the capitals to execute his development plan. He needs them. He can't do it all only in Bogota, and that's absolutely clear. So I hope he understands the situation. And to also see in the mediators who are the Congress people an opportunity. I have a hypothesis, something that's crazy, yes, but it could work in this political scenario. And it's that a certain former president of the Republic will try to play a role as a mediator, especially in Antioquia and Medellin. And that will be interesting. I think Uribe can be a mediator between Petro and the new authorities in Medellin because and I also think that Uribe has shown that his attitude towards Petro is pragmatic because he knows that he has to take care of himself and that Petro can hurt him, especially with the new fiscal that will come. So my hypothesis is that Uribe will try to be a mediator, and he can do it. I think he can, because Petro and Uribe understand each other well from their gut, not with their head, but with their gut, because they're quite similar in that way. And I think that there could be an opportunity there. I think that that's my hypothesis. I mean, what could happen with Antioquia? That we've got the 4G that are not financed very well. We have EPM that's strategic and its future and its projects and plans. We have Hidroituango, we have Metro of 80th Street. I mean, Duque promised 70% of those resources and other strategic projects like the train that will join the Abu Dhabi Valley. And there, the national government is core. So I don't think it's as simple of saying goodbye, Petro, and we forget the nation. Although we do have our own resources in Antioquia and Medellin. I think what will come is interesting. Laura, you have the last word. My question about this is, and I'd say, Sergio and Santiago say, with the exception of what the former presidents have said. And it's the possibility of having conciliation of Petro towards the opposition. And the Bible says you cannot place new wine in an old jar. Do you agree with this? Or what's your opinion about this? Look, I agree with what Sergio and Santiago say. This country is always in the electoral mode, where we end one election the day after we start to see what can be done for the next election. And that situation will be seen regionally between local leaders and the national government, and between the Congress and the political leaders and the national government. Everything will be dependent on the elections but what we will see surely is a group like the Char group wanting to carry out whatever the nation wants to co-finance and all the needs they have from the nation, trying to have a good relation, but also thinking about 2026, because the Char group is an opposition group and with national ambition. So we'll see the constant dilemma for the Char. And we'll see that also for Petro and the national government. And it's for him to have his reforms going abided to, and at the same time, how to organize and to structure the political policies for the 2026 elections. And I believe that this is a reality that's quite dramatic for the country, because at the end, we all depend on that electoral game. We start to see different priorities and interests. With regards to 2026, I'd like to say that these elections from Sunday, beyond Petro and the clans, give us projects that want to play an important role. We talked about Galan in Bogota, but we have the party of Galan for 2026 is something we should keep an eye on. So Galan not only won the mayor's office on Sunday, yes, but he also won in its party that of Cartagena, Cali, and smaller mayors like Pasto, Florencia, San Jose, Guaviare, and that turns this Galan group, since they're interested in being the next president, in main players for the next elections. We have Claudia to see her role also in those elections. Quintero, who was going to be important for Pacto Histórico, and this will also be part of what will happen. And Carlos Caicedo, a figure that was also questioned, that won in Magdalena and has national ambitions and will be a minister soon. So I feel that everything that will happen, of course, we're making more questions than answers, but it will all be crossed by the 2026 elections. Laura, Sergio, Santiago, thank you. What an honor to share with you this time. I'd like to mention again that the video of all this will be on our website today, this afternoon, or tomorrow at the latest. And I'd like to remind you that on November 9th, we have our next webinar about the new constitutional project in Chile, with people that's really part of the committee of experts to draft or make comments about the proposal of the Constitution. Thank you all again for joining us. And we will follow up Colombia as always. We'll see you again. Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.
Thank you. Goodbye.